Hello and welcome back to Warlords and Revolutionaries. In 1839-42, a trade dispute led to war between Qing Dynasty China and Great Britain, which resulted in the one-sided Treaty of Nanjing. The Qing military showed itself to be hopelessly outmatched by the better trained and equipped British military. Their coastal forts proved to be unable to withstand combined arms assaults from sea and land, and their ill-disciplined troops lacked the means and motivation to put up a determined defense that might have convinced the British to relent, or at least not lose in such spectacular fashion. The loss of Nanjing meant Beijing would no longer be receiving the shipments of grain from the Yangtze River Valley on which the capital's people depended, and would soon be starved into submission. Half the banner population of the empire lived in Beijing. This threat to the empire's support base made the pressure on the dynasty that much more powerful. Among other things, the Treaty of Nanjing allowed foreigners to trade in several more ports on the coast and along the Yangtze. It granted British citizens extraterritoriality, and it granted missionaries the right to preach in treaty ports without persecution. The Chinese took thousands of casualties in battle, while most of the British casualties were taken by disease that broke out in the garrison occupying Zhoushan Island. But despite these staggering losses, almost no one thought it meant anything needed to change. Some pirates had gotten the better of them. It was a fluke, a one-off, not something that signaled the beginning of a century of such defeats transforming China from a regional superpower into a semi-colonized backwater. That could never happen. And that's why I think the First Opium War is overrated. Looking back on it, we can see it was the start of a new trend, but it actually changed very little at the time. Foreigners were in a few more ports, but most of the people lived in the countryside and weren't affected. Only a tiny minority of Qing officials thought they would have to adopt some reforms to be ready to face the West again, and they had no impact on the overall political climate. Even Western powers were not yet convinced they could push China around with impunity. As foreigners set themselves up in the new treaty ports, Chinese peasants continued living as they always had. A new settlement was being built on some island off the south coast, and imperial examinations kept on being held. Little to nothing else changed as life went on through the 1840s. Occasional rebellions, especially in the south, attested to the tension between ruler and ruled. But there was nothing to indicate that the bloodiest war of the 19th century would soon carve a swath of destruction from Canton to Tianjin. To understand why this sudden explosion of violence was to rip the country apart, we're going to take this episode to explore the origins, beliefs, and tenets of the Taiping Revolutionary Movement and its leader. Of the many Chinese clans participating in the examinations, one was the Hung, a Hakka clan living in Guangdong province. As I indicated in the first episode, the region south of the Yangtze River is one of the most diverse parts of China. In Guangdong, nearly all people are part of the Han ethnicity. However, as I also pointed out in episode 1, this doesn't mean they all speak the same language or have the same culture. Most speak Yue, which is better known in English as Cantonese, but there are also significant numbers of Min and Hakka speakers, who each have their own language with its own set of dialects. Min is the oldest of these, as it broke off of Old Chinese at about the same time as it was turning into Middle Chinese sometime in the first 6 centuries AD. Middle Chinese then broke down into the other varieties of Chinese that exist today, including Cantonese, similar to how Latin broke down into the Romance languages. Having originated somewhere in the mid-range of the Yellow River, the Hakka migrated south in stages and only arrived in Guangdong and neighboring provinces a mere few hundred years prior to the 19th century, which marked them as outsiders to all those around them. Arriving in a region already populated by multiple well-established linguistic groups, the Hakka had to make do with what land was left over, often living in less fertile and less desirable land in the hills, and elsewhere off the beaten track. The shared experience of their migrations had forged them into a distinct subgroup of Han, with their own language, and they traditionally view other Hakka as being part of a wider family, and help each other where they can. Being surrounded by often hostile peoples reinforced the bond between different Hakka groups, as they had no one else to rely on. The Hakka have a kind of a bipolar history. To survive, they've taken jobs no one else wanted, like mining, or turned to banditry. At various times, they've produced towering national figures, or dominated national politics more than any other single ethno-linguistic group in the country, while at other times, they've been the victims of genocide. The Hung clan had produced many individuals who rose to prominence in the civil service during the Qing Dynasty, but that was a long time ago. Since then, they had slid down the socioeconomic ladder. By the early 1800s, few of them had made it anywhere in the bureaucracy, though not for lack of trying. The man I'm about to introduce went by many names throughout his life, as was common in those days. His parents gave him the name hsiu-ch'uan. When he married, he was given the name Rankun, but history knows him by the name he gave himself, hsiu-ch'uan. Hong hsiu-ch'uan was born on January 1st, 1814 in Guangdong. His early life was like that of millions of other Chinese boys in the 19th century. He was born into an agricultural family, and though his father was headman of several villages, they were neither rich nor poor. He passed the prefecture examination with flying colors in 1827. With high hopes, he set off for Canton in 1830 to take the provincial examination, but failed to make the grade. The fact that millions of others had failed in similar fashion didn't make it any less crushing. His only choice was to go back home with nothing to show for his efforts, except that he was able to get a job as a schoolteacher in his village. In 1836, he went to Canton to try his luck again. Although he failed again, this visit to Canton was to prove fruitful in ways that wouldn't come to the surface until years later. The first was that he attended the lectures of a scholar named Chu Tzu-chi. At the time, mainstream Confucianism taught that humans are born good and they must be educated so as to keep them on the path of moral uprightness. Zhu was part of a tradition that taught that humans are born evil and must be steered by education onto the path of moral uprightness. This different interpretation of the classics influenced Hung's later beliefs, which had their foundation in the second formative experience in Canton in 1836. One day, while exiting the examination hall, Hung encountered a foreign missionary and his interpreter, preaching the gospel to examinees and anyone else who would listen. He asked them about their religion that day and the next, and they gave him a set of gospel pamphlets and encouraged him that he would one day, quote, attain the highest rank, end quote. If life was a novel, then that was foreshadowing. Hung took the pamphlets home and put them away on the shelf without giving them much more than a glance. The next year, Hung went to Canton for the third time to take the examination, and for the third time failed. At this point, his psyche buckled, and he suffered a nervous breakdown. If you've ever been to university, then you're familiar with the pressure Hung was under. He'd passed the prefecture examination when he was 13, and was now 27. Getting a degree and working in the bureaucracy was his life's aspiration. It was what his father had prepared him for years. He'd sunk quite a bit of money into his education, as had his parents, so that he could get his degree. His parents, his siblings, his wife, his whole family pinned their hopes on him to raise them up out of rural obscurity. Getting a degree was the only way he could make something of himself. He fell sick, was confined to bed, and, believing his end was near, Hung said goodbye to his parents. Quote, "O my parents, how badly have I returned the favor of your love to me. I shall never attain a name that may reflect its luster upon you." End quote. The words of a man who believed his life was was a failure. But everything was about to change. That same year, 1837, Hung had a series of visions while in his delirious state. In one vision, he was taken from his room up to heaven, where he was washed clean and given new organs to replace his filthy old organs, before being taken to an old man with a golden beard who sat on a throne. The man lamented that, although he created and sustained the world, few of its people gave him the proper veneration. He then gave Hung a sword, and ordered him to exterminate the demons people worshipped, but to spare his brothers and sisters. In other visions, Hung met a middle-aged man who claimed to be his older brother, and the two of them traveled all over the world hunting down and destroying evil spirits. Although at first he was comatose in bed, Hung would later get out of bed and jump around his room, waving his arms as if he was a soldier fighting in battle, and shouting about slaying demons. Things went on like this for some time, with Hung pleading with anyone he met to venerate the old man on the throne, while mocking anyone who said he'd gone crazy or was possessed by a demon. After the visions subsided, Hung went back to his mundane life as a rural schoolteacher. Yet, he was a changed man. His demeanor and mannerisms were different, more dignified, more in line with the role he believed he was to play as the ruler of all China. He composed poems about himself in this role, and he changed his name to hsiu-ch'uan. In 1843, he took the examination for a fourth and last time. This time, his failure enraged him, and he decided he would start a revolution, stating in his anger that he would administer examinations rather than the Manchus. Things only began to pick up the following year, however, when a cousin happened to notice the gospel pamphlets on his shelf, and read them. He was so fascinated by their contents, he told Hung about them, and Hung instantly concluded the pamphlets were the key to his visions. The venerable old man on the throne he identified as God. The middle-aged man was Jesus Christ. He, Hung hsiu-ch'uan, was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and the brothers and sisters he was to spare were God's other children, the mass of humanity who rejected God and worshipped demons instead. And specifically, they were the people of China. Hung believed that the visions and the pamphlets were mutually reinforcing. Quote, "If I had received the books without having gone through the sickness, I should not have dared to believe in them, or have ventured, on my own account, to oppose the customs of the whole world. If I had merely been sick, but had not also received the books, I should have had no further evidence as to the truth of my visions, which might also have been considered as merely the productions of a diseased imagination." End quote. By the way, all these quotes are coming from The Taiping Revolutionary Movement by Ren Yuan. So, what are we to make of all this? Well, it's been suggested that Hung hsiu-ch'uan, while experiencing his visions, was in what's called a twilight state, a state in which the subject loses conscious control of their body and mind, doesn't respond to external stimuli, makes involuntary movements, and experiences hallucinations, among other symptoms. One problem with this theory is that people who experience a twilight state also usually don't remember much, if anything, of what happened while in that state. One cynical hypothesis goes that Hung simply made everything up. He wanted power, so he made up a story to act as the basis of the ideology of his bloody revolution. That's hard to prove or disprove, though. This kind of hypothesis is rarely made as a result of careful evidence-based research, but rather an accusation made to discredit someone. Another possibility is that maybe he really did receive a vision from God. I don't believe he did, and you probably don't either, but Hung seemed totally convinced that he really had been commissioned by God to destroy the demons in China and free his brother and sister Chinese from the oppression of the foreign Manchus. Millions of others followed him, and although not every Taiping soldier fully converted to Hung's brand of Christianity, hundreds of thousands of them would give their lives to see his dream realized. But that's still years in the future. After reading the pamphlets, Hung was filled with a new religious fervor. In what would become one of the hallmarks of the Taiping, he and his cousin destroyed everything in their homes and in Hung's school that could be interpreted as idols, and began spreading their new faith. Two more of his cousins were among the earliest converts, Feng Yunshan and Hong Rengan. You don't really need to remember the second name right now, but he'll be very important later. The new religion was spreading fast, but Hung's hot temper and uncompromising attitude led to a souring of his relationship with the village elders, who fired him. He left with several others and went to the neighboring Guangxi province for some time, and while traveling there, Feng Yunshan became separated from Hung, preaching his way to the Thistle Mountains in a remote part of northwestern Guangxi. Meanwhile, Hung and Rengan went to Canton on the invitation of an American missionary, Issachar Roberts, who'd heard about the burgeoning Christian church. It's not clear whether this was the point at which Hung was able to obtain a full Bible or not, but he did read it while there. Unfortunately, Hung and Roberts had a falling out over a misunderstanding about money, but Hung was glad to have had the opportunity to read the Bible and other Christian literature while there. After leaving Canton, Hung went to find Feng Yunshan, who'd been missing since their visit to Guangxi several years earlier, and discovered Feng had been busy establishing a thriving Christian community in the Thistle Mountains. Hung decided this was the perfect base for the religion to grow, and for his plans for a revolution to begin. It was now 1847, 10 years since the visions. They became known as the Society of God Worshippers, and spread quickly, mainly among the local Hakka population for a number of reasons. For one, Hung had declared that an epidemic was coming soon to punish unbelievers, and that only God worshippers would be safe from it. Sure enough, an epidemic did indeed sweep through the area, giving credence to Hung's word. For another, the militant iconoclasm of the god worshippers impressed some people, who, seeing the destruction of the idols of local deities go unanswered by those deities, decided the god worshippers must be correct. There were also stories of visions and miracles going around that seemed to confirm what the god worshippers were saying. When Hung arrived at Thistle Mountain, there had been 3,000 well-organized members of the society, and it was growing steadily from there. Perhaps the most important reason for large-scale conversions, though, was the paramilitary wing of the Society of God Worshippers. I mentioned earlier that Hakka communities often found themselves relegated to less desirable lands and surrounded by hostile neighbors, who saw them as interlopers, leading to frequent feuding. In the area around the Thistle Mountain, there lived Hakka, Yao, Cantonese, and some Zhuang communities. The 1840s saw inter-ethnic conflicts flare up in the area, mainly pitting Hakka against Yao. Although there was an official militia led by local magistrates, these were more of a protection racket than anything else. They didn't have any interest in actual combat, especially if the people they were supposed to be protecting couldn't pay their extortionate demands, which the Hakka usually couldn't. The Society of God Worshippers mobilized to face the threat, and quickly became the most effective organization at fighting the Yao. They were the only organization their fellow Hakka could turn to, so naturally many of them decided to join the society. The corruption of local magistrates in general, which was a problem of pandemic proportions all over the empire, also drove people into the hands of the god worshippers, as they had a reputation for honesty. As the god worshippers gained vital combat experience, they armed themselves using money donated by wealthy society members, and became ever larger and more organized. It would be fair, then, to ask why the local authorities didn't stamp out the growth of this group that threatened their power more and more as the months went by. Well, the South had always been held by the Qing government more tenuously than the North. There were fewer banner garrisons, and none of them were occupied by Manchus, being manned instead by Han bannermen, The South had seen the last stand of Ming loyalists before the entirety of China was conquered, and it was the base of the Three Feudatories Rebellion. It saw obstinate resistance by the Miao Yao peoples, who proved to be resilient enough that many of their communities were left alone by the Qing. It was also the base of the Triad societies. More on them next episode. The political climate of the 1840s further answers the question. The emperor, who was still the Daoguang emperor, who'd reigned during the First Opium War, didn't like hearing negative reports from his subordinates about disturbances in the provinces. Everything should be peaceful and harmonious, and if there were any disturbances, the governors should take care of it themselves. Therefore, officials were hesitant to report troublesome rebellious movements, often bending the truth or lying to make things sound more peaceful than they really were. Many of these were the same officials who'd been lying to the emperor about the progress of the Opium War, remember. The governor of Guangdong at the time felt the same way as the emperor, but even more strongly, and would reprimand local magistrates who came to him with reports about bandits and rebels. As a result, there was no coordination between magistrates in charge of different prefectures or counties about the growing problem the god-worshippers presented them with. There was also no intervention by the army until it was too late to nip the revolution in the bud, the problem being left to local militias to deal with. The militias were organized and bankrolled by the gentry, local landlords, scholars, and business owners, but not merchants, who felt obligated to perpetuate China's Confucian traditions. They also wanted to protect their own privileges as members of the gentry, which were tied up with the bureaucracy and Qing government. To the commoners who made up the rank and file of the militia, however, it was just a job. They were not ideologically invested like the gentry, they were just interested in the paycheck. Hence their morale was fragile. To the god-worshippers, what they were doing wasn't just a job. They were zealous for their new faith, and fanatically loyal to their new leader, God's son, commissioned to lead the Chinese people into a better future. They earned a reputation as fearsome and determined fighters. During this time, hsiu-ch'uan developed his religio-political ideas. The gospel pamphlets he'd received contained passages from the Bible, but they were poorly translated, hard to understand, and at times, incomprehensible. Hung refined them, correcting and clarifying them, molding his beliefs into a dogma for the society at large to follow. He developed the idea that all nations in the world had been created by God, and thus were his children. All men and women were brothers and sisters. Each nation had been given its own estate, as a father would divide his land between his sons. Every nation should live happily in its own estate, but, as Hung saw it, the Manchus had flagrantly disobeyed this natural order of things by invading and conquering the Chinese estate, squeezing its people for profits to spend on frivolous luxuries. Thus the Manchus were evil, and should be forced out of China by all means necessary, along with any Chinese people who refused to join their fellow Chinese in this cause. Little thought seems to have been taken as to the incredibly complex question of what exactly constitutes a nation, or what differentiates nations from each other. Like many of the movers and shakers of history, he dealt in absolutes. To Hung, the world was black and white. China was one nation, Manchuria was another. Manchus needed to be expelled from China to return the situation to the way it should be. Expounding the nuances of the convoluted relationship between history, language, political nationality, and genetic heritage that make up what defines ethnicity doesn't seem to have been of interest to him, if it even occurred to him at all. It's hard to get the masses riled up over nuances. As for the Christianity of Hung, it needs to be noted that most Christian denominations, modern and contemporary, would denounce it as heretical. It was, in the words of historian Ran Yuan, a Christianized Confucianism. It'd be unfair to characterize it as merely some Christian trappings pasted over top of Confucianism, but Hung's conception of Christianity was closely informed by his Confucian background. For example, familial ties are very important in Confucianism, and so Hung extrapolated that if there is a heavenly father and a heavenly elder brother, then there must also be a heavenly mother and a heavenly sister-in-law. Jesus Christ, or the heavenly elder brother as Hung called him, was God's son, but was by no means equal to God. In Chinese philosophy, for a son to be equal to his father was more than irrational, it was inconceivable. The concept of the Trinity hadn't been explained in the pamphlets Hung read. When he read about it while visiting Roberts and Canton, his core ideas were already firmly rooted in his mind, so he dismissed the concept out of hand, even when it was pointed out to him in the Bible. Mencius, a student of Confucius, had written that it would be better not to have books at all than to believe everything you read in them. Therefore, Hung surmised, the Bible must contain errors. Only he himself, as the second son of God, could discern with finality what was true and what was untrue. Even the gospel pamphlets, which had such a critical role in defining his beliefs, were edited by him to clarify and correct passages he believed weren't quite right. Now, there are those who have accused Hung hsiu-ch'uan of having very little to do with the actual operation of his own revolution. It's true that Hung never led armies in the field, and once the heavenly capital was established, he never seems to have left its walls, and rarely even left the confines of his own palace. The same could be said of Qing rulers after the 17th century. Hung was a vital figurehead for the movement. He was the rallying point of the whole religio-political ideology, a religio-political ideology which was indelibly stamped with his ideas, his conceptions of right and wrong, truth and lie. Others had a role to play in formulating it, but none played nearly so vital a role as Hung hsiu-ch'uan. So, while he did delegate most responsibilities to subordinates, I think it's fair to say that it was his movement, and he was a vital part of it. There's more that can be said about Taiping Tianguo, its governmental system, its social policies, the other leaders and generals who shaped the revolution's policies and ideology, but I'll leave it there for now, as those will be easier to introduce once we get into the narrative on the course of the Civil War. Join us next time as we get into that epic story.